Hi, welcome to this third and final video in my three-part series on tackling the unseen section of the literature paper 2. Click on the links in the description box to see parts 1 and 2, where I talk you through understanding an unseen poem and constructing a 24-mark answer. Today I'm going to show you on how to construct the 8-mark answer, where you'll be asked to compare two unseen poems. We will continue looking at the 2017 paper. Let's get started. In the first video in this series, I walked you through these 7 steps to enable you to understand and annotate an unseen poem in just 5 minutes. When looking at the second poem for the 8-mark question, you can make this process faster by reading the question first, instead of waiting until step 4. Remember, for this second question in the unseen section, although you will need to understand and annotate a second poem, you do not need to go into quite as much depth as before. As we did before, let's start by understanding the question. So if we highlight the key parts to this question, we can see that we are being asked to describe the attitudes of the speakers to the seasons. The word attitudes refers to how the speakers describe their feelings and approach. We are then asked to compare the similarities and differences between these attitudes. When you're asked to compare similarities and differences, it is always best to make sure that you include both in your answer, but if you think that it's needed, you can have a bias towards one. For instance, if you had a bias towards them being more similar than different, you could say something like, although these poems have subtle differences, they both describe, and so on. Or if you thought they had more differences than similarities, you could say something like, both poets describe seasons, but their attitudes are very different to one another. And finally, we're asked to look at the ways the poets present their attitudes. This means that you need to analyse the poem from a technical point of view, as well as demonstrating that you understand their meanings. Unlike the last question, this question only assesses you on AO2. And this is what the examiners want. You can see that regardless of the level your answer is, you must comment on the effects of the writer's methods. So simply identifying, say, personification isn't enough. You must analyse what effect it has on the reader and maybe the meaning. For a demonstration of this, take a look at part 1 of this series. If we climb this grade ladder, we can see that a basic answer will include some links to the question, to either language, structure and form. But for a higher grade, not only will your comments be completely relevant to the question, but it will include more than one of those 3 elements. Those 3 elements being language, structure and form. To get an even higher grade, you will need to add a thoughtful comparison, which means that you have clearly considered the possible effects of the features that you comment on. For instance, saying that alliteration emphasises the point is not very thoughtful, but saying that alliteration intensifies feelings of, say, happiness because of the repetition of the whatever sound is very specific, relevant and thoughtful. Now, looking at how to get the top marks, you should explore all 3 elements. This means using words like this suggests or words like perhaps when writing about the different effects that one feature could have. So let's take a look at how we can annotate the second poem to give ourselves a chance of getting full marks. Here is the second poem. Press pause on this video to have a quick read. To remind you, the first poem, which is called Autumn, is about a speaker who describes the season in a negative way. The speaker compares it to an experienced robber, which is used as an extended metaphor. The season is described as something that steals things like the green stuff from trees. The poem ends in a tone of anger. In the first video where I analysed this poem, I suggested that perhaps the speaker has bad memories associated with the season, or maybe when the poet wrote the poem, he was experiencing personal difficulties. So now looking at the second poem, remember we want to comment on language, structure and form. I always start with a title. Unlike Autumn, this title isn't focused on the season. When we read the poem, we see how the speaker describes a perfect day, and the title is more focused on the day itself rather than the season. The last line also returns to the word today, which creates a circular effect. We find out that it's spring, So when thinking of similarities and differences between the poems, we can already identify that the poets are referring to different seasons. It is also described as being perfect, which is a contrast to autumn, where the season is described more negatively as an experienced robber. Also, the speaker refers to a breeze, unlike autumn, where a far more aggressive wind is described. We also see how the weather is welcomed, but in autumn we sense that the speaker feels violated. Now, looking at some poetic devices, we see a lot of enjambment and caesura, which creates a cheery, almost song-like tone. There is also a lot more punctuation than what we see in autumn. However, a similarity is the alliteration that is used, except the effect is different in each poem. Here, the flowers are described as a joyous sight. It reminds us of fresh life, whereas the colours referred to in autumn are described as being distracting, and by using the extended metaphor to an experienced robber, the season is described as being cunning, a word which is actually used in the poem. In summary, spring is being described with pure descriptions, whereas autumn is described as being full of deceit. This image here reminds us of a snow globe, and it gives the poem a dreamy quality. And finally, the poet reminds us of how this poem describes a perfect day, very different to autumn. So when looking at the form and structure, we see that this poem is in 9 couplets. This is stanzas which have 2 lines each, and this definitely gives it a song-like and cheery quality. Autumn, on the other hand, is just 1 stanza in length, and it's almost like a rant from someone who is unhappy. And although we see some figurative language, most of it's quite conversational, as though the reader is being told a story. So let's remind ourselves of the question. We need to look at the similarities and differences in how the poets approach and feel about the 2 seasons. When planning a response for comparing texts, a good way to do it is through a table. In this case, we are looking at similarities and differences, so a table is probably the quickest and easiest method. Here's my plan. If this isn't enough to help you structure an answer, you could also annotate your table to plan the order you will discuss your points in. If you feel confident enough, you can use this plan or yours to try constructing an 8-mark answer. In just a minute, I will show you mine, so just press pause if you want to have a go. Here is my answer according to my plan. Press pause to have a quick read. You can see that although I have discussed similarities and differences, I have definitely included more differences because, in my opinion, the poets present their attitudes towards the seasons very differently. Structurally, I started my answer by describing the overall similarity and difference. This tells the reader what I'm about to discuss. My first paragraph starts by discussing the titles, which leads me to describing the tones of each poem, which is created by its form and structure. I then move on to language and other writers' methods. For each, I have explained the impact and have included quotes to support my analysis. In conclusion, I have summarised the poem in relation to the writer's methods and its impact. It's hard for me to give you a sample structure, as it will depend on the question, and of course, there is more than one way to tackle this question. The best way to master this skill is by practicing. I hope you found this video series useful. Please subscribe to my channel for more updates, and if you have any requests, please mention them in the comments and I will do my best to create a video for you. Remember that the more you practice, the better you will become at answering these questions. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.